So, friends, let's break down what the portal is made of. Initially, when it was being created, the idea was to make it so that every aspect could be customized, especially for those who primarily need it for rendering in cinematics. The goal was to make it suitable both for cinematics and for games, so that you could simply drop it into a scene and use it without having to dig through a long list of parameters or study the documentation. That's how the idea was born, to create a system that could be called a module. Let's take a look at what it's made of and how it all works. First of all, we have the blueprints folder, where you can clearly see the portals themselves, place the specific one you need or are interested in directly onto the scene. Let's take, for example, a random portal. First, in the Details tab, you'll be able to see the components it consists of. Select each one individually, and you can adjust its parameters. First is the static mesh. Here you have a separate model for your portal. Initially, you'll probably need to adjust it so that it fits. In the Demo tab, you'll see the SM portal. Drag it onto the scene. The red arrow shows its forward direction. Here you have your own static mesh, for example, let's say like this one, and it's facing a different direction and has a different size. And probably if your pivot point is offset somewhere, you'll need to adjust it. In Unreal, starting from version 5. Oh, there's a modeling tool where, first of all, in the Transform tab, you can adjust the pivot, center it, that's the first thing. And secondly, rotate and copy the location from the original portal and paste it into yours. Now you need to visually adjust its size and set its direction forward as well, so that they match exactly with the inner ring. After you set it up, you'll see baked in the Transform tab. Select it and click Accept to apply the changes. That's it. Your model, your static mesh, is ready to be replaced. Next, we have the point light. This is a light source that illuminates a small area around the portal. Radii, the radius is determined by the first two and the last parameters here. Attention radius, source, and soft source radius. If you need to enlarge the portal, there is a separate parameter for that scale. It allows you to proportionally increase the size of the portal and all the numerous particles flying around it, with the notable exception of the light sources. So if you significantly enlarge the portal, you consequently need to separately increase the radius of the associated light sources and also boost their overall intensity. The second is the spotlight. Unlike the point light, it doesn't illuminate an area, but is used to create illusory patterns on the floor, which you can see as if they're being sucked into the portal. In the spotlight, under the light function tab, the material used is light, portal light. Each portal has its own. Here, there is, first of all, the control parameter, speed X, speed Y, and the same speeds for distortion. So you need to choose the texture you want and adjust these parameters. Just tweak them by eye to get the result you want. Nothing complicated. Mainly the speeds play the key role to set the patterns in motion and to choose the texture. Everything else is just fine-tuning that you can adjust. Next, we have the negated system Vortex. What is it? It consists of this central part and this energy vortex, which either sucks in or, on the contrary, draws out energy, depending on how you set it up. First, there is the color parameter. You don't need to adjust the distortion, just leave everything at the default settings. The main thing that matters here is the materials. The first material is responsible for this energy that swirls around the portal. Let's briefly take a look at its key parameters. So here we have 3 distinct tabs. These are the color variation settings, the general controls, and the textures. Let's start with the general settings. First, we have distortion and texture. In the Textures tab, you can choose whichever one you want. Next, you can adjust their tiling and speed parameters. Again, if we set the speeds to 0, it freezes. By adjusting the speeds, we set it in motion. It's important here that you can specify negative values to make the movement go in the opposite direction. Not pulling in, but pushing out. The second parameter controls right and left. The same parameters are available for the distortion. So you select a texture, then edit the speed. The distortion texture and the main texture affect each other. What do we have next? We have the shape. First, this is the overall distortion of the texture. Next, we have the essential elements of contrast, brightness, and refraction. Let's carefully increase each of them and observe precisely what happens. Now it looks more like a black hole. It's better to be careful with this parameter and not set it to very high values. Next, we have global settings. First, Let's break down what fade distance is. This is a particular setting that effectively removes any harsh and undesirable lines when our powerful energy vortex precisely collides with any given surface. In other words, we specify that at a radius of 400, the fading begins. Next, we have Fresnel. It controls visibility at an angle. So if we look straight at it, everything is visible. If we look at it from an angle, say we set it to 1, nothing is visible. If we choose a high value, you can see that these edges here are very sharp. If you truly want to smoothly refine them out, you can simply lower this particular value to effectively achieve a much more natural and aesthetically realistic result. Next, we have the remaining color settings to discuss in detail. First, there's a specific texture here, which is precisely called color variation. It consists of this kind of multicolored, blurred texture, or rather, a blend of various colors and hues, creating a unique visual effect. What does it do? Here, there's a parameter called color warp blend, which means blending with it. If we set it to 1, the color will be the one we select right here. For example, we can consider light blue, blue, and so on. This particular parameter allows us to effectively blend the specific blue color. That is to say, to give it some subtle shades of other colors, so it doesn't appear flat or one-dimensional. And at the top, this is the intensity or saturation of this texture. If we turn it down or up, it doesn't really matter which way, you'll see the colors become overly saturated. The 3 parameters at the top also control this texture. First, there's the hue shift. In other words, it simply changes the colors. These are very subtle adjustments that you should make at the very end. The second is offset, which also doesn't really do much. It's also for adding some variation. And finally, the last one, which has a strong effect, is multiplying by a certain color, for example, blue or green, and so on. You multiply by a certain color to achieve the mood of the scene that you want. These are the main settings, the same parameters like distortion and so on. They are also present in other materials. For example, let's take a look at the portal material. This is the material for the texture, or rather the image. It's at the center of the portal. And the second one is on the reverse side. Let's open it up and take a look. First of all, here is the image, the texture. You can replace it here if you want to use your own. At the bottom, we have the same offset displacement, and there's also a tint. You can easily multiply it by specific color if you want to precisely adjust it. Next up, we have the important feature of tiling, which essentially controls the scaling of the texture, or rather, it's repetitive tiling. There's also the option for adjusting contrast, applying a hue shift, and performing the saturation. All of these are the same fundamental parameter. Usually, you should keep it in the range from 0 to 1, brightness. And these main parameters are the parallax settings. That is, when we move closer or farther away, how the image will look. For example, let's increase this value. When I move away, the image gets smaller. When I get closer, it becomes larger. The parallax illusion is configured here, and the top 3 parameters are texture distortion. Next, we have the actual ring material itself. Let's take a closer look at this particular portal so it's more clearly visible. The ring is an effect at the edge of the portals. It's a ring that adds a little flare. Here they are. For example, let's change it. There. Its settings are pretty much the same. Brightness, timing, speed, distortion, density, sharpness, and offset. Here too you can choose the texture you want. If it shifts like this, you need to reduce the distortion strength, and adjust the offset. Basically, as usual, just adjust it by eye. It's pretty intuitive from the names, what each setting does. You don't need any precise pinpoint adjustments. All of them can be tweaked to your liking. And finally, is the central effect. Let's take a closer look at this particular one. There are 2 vortices that seem to be sucking inward. It has pretty much the same parameters. You choose the color, adjust the speeds, tweak the shades, variation, color, and so on. The only thing you truly need to keep in mind is that this particular pattern texture channel precisely determines which specific channel of the texture will be used. In this case, if we're using a simple black and white texture, then each channel will inherently produce the exact same result. However, if you have a more complex texture, for example, let's say a detailed pattern, each of its individual channels is separated individually. On the red channel, it has one pattern. On the green, another. And on the blue, yet another. This way, you can choose which channel to use from the list. The exact same thing is available in the portal energy material. Only here you select the checkbox for the one you want to use. That's pretty much everything regarding the portal settings. But we'll talk about some further points later. All that's left are the sparks particles. They have their own parameters, which are more or less the same. First of all, they are located in the VFX sparks folder. Here, there are 3 options with collision and 1 without collision. The ones with collision do what you can see here. When the sparks touch a surface, they bounce off. These ones, don't have collision, but they work more or less the same way. There are 2 types of them. First, there are these components, which get sucked into the very center in various different types. And then there are these 2, the specific ones you need for the Vortex. But their settings are more or less the same. You do not need to adjust the scale. This particular parameter is for adjusting settings within the blueprint, just do not touch it at all. We have the number of particles being created, and we have colors you can choose from. Curl noise is basically chaos, you could say. They'll either move smoothly, or they'll move with this kind of chaos. Next, we have the size. This is the minimum size and the maximum size. The second part, the third and fourth are the maximum on the x-axis, the minimum on the y-axis, the minimum on the x-axis, and the maximum on the x-axis. Actually, it's the other way around. These are the y's, and these are the x's. Adjust the size. Next, we have height and radius. Let's lower it a bit so we can take a look. Maybe let's set it to 55 here. You can see that it now covers a wider radius, and its height has also increased. And the size, the radius, adjust it to fit the size of your portal. Next, we have track it. This is the resistance or deceleration of the sparks movement. If it's set to 0, for example, they won't stop. The higher the value, the faster they become. Next, we have the lifetime. How long do these sparks live? Next is the force of attraction or repulsion. Let's look at this parameter with an example. For example, using this one as an example, it is set to -500. If we increase this value, they will be pulled in more strongly. Or, on the contrary, if we make it positive, they will be pushed out. These particles have an additional parameter, a distinct and unique parameter. If such vortexes have a cylinder X radius, these have a sphere surface radius, there's only a small difference. Both types ultimately determine the overall size and the precise radius of the object in question. The last parameter is vortex force, that is the rotational force and the size of the particles. So the settings for these particles are quite intuitive. Let me delete them. This way you can easily adjust them and utilize as many as you truly desire. For example, in the very last portal, they are specifically used here a total of 8 of them, each with their own distinct settings. You just add what you need and configure it. In this case, the quantity is very small, 15, 55, 150. It doesn't cost anything. So in terms of optimization, there's nothing to worry about if you use this in games. In fact, if you use large values, for example, here 8 are used, while the first one only has 3, but this one has 5,000 particles. Even if you add up all the particles from this portal over 8 months, the total won't reach that number. So the question isn't actually how many sparks particles you use, but rather what's really important is the total number of particles generated, the actual particle count of all. Next, there are some important nuances and specific considerations that are particularly relevant for their effective use in modern games and for high-quality cinematics. First of all, the animation process itself is typically very simple and straightforward. Just import your cinematic, click the plus button, and here you'll see all the components: point light, sparks, vortex, and so on. Remove whatever you need. For example, vortex. Again, click plus, and at the top, you'll see all its parameters: hue, color. In this particular way, you can easily animate all of the various components, all their parameters, except for those parameters that are inside the material. So when you open the material, you'll see these parameters except for those. You can animate all the parameters that are exposed here separately for the particles and for the vortex. The entire portal as a whole, and in the same way, this applies to the point light and spotlight sources. Now, regarding how to replace the image, as I already mentioned, the image is responsible for this material. You simply change it here to the one you need and adjust it, matching it to a certain hue. That's the first thing. But if you need to use it, if you want the portal to display something that is somewhere else in your scene, suppose you want this portal to display this particular frame, then you can use the following method. Place a scene capture 3D in your scene. This is a special camera that renders. You need to create a texture for this camera. Right-click here in the Textures tab and select Render Target. Open it. Now, you can effectively use this particular texture within that specific camera. In the Capture Source method, please carefully select the Final Color option to significantly increase the overall quality and visual fidelity. This way, you can broadcast what this camera sees onto this texture. And you can use this same texture, for example, right here. Let's take a look. There's a strong distortion. Let's remove it. There. And probably this parallax effect as well. Well, now in this particular portal, we can clearly see what this camera actually sees. However, there's one crucial thing to consider. This camera meticulously renders every single frame, and the higher the resolution of the texture you specifically define here, the more resource intensive and demanding it ultimately becomes. This will be the first thing. If you're shooting some kind of rental, it might not always matter to you. If you want to use the portal for games, it's better not to use this method or do the following to avoid it. Of course, we'll lose some dynamism, but nevertheless, you can right-click and bake our texture. Find the style of the texture and use this already fixed texture inside instead of this one. So our image will be fixed, completely and utterly frozen. However, this is much better than using it as is. That's how it's done. However, if you still need it to be dynamic, you either need to adjust these parameters, the distortions, to create some illusion of movement, or you'll need to do it manually, which means you will have to perform this action yourself within the blueprint system. Let's take a look. You need to bake it manually. How is this done? It's very easy. Select the object, which is your camera. It has a function for that. Create some kind of timer. Set it to a period of, say, 0.2 or whatever interval you want. Or you can do it using a delay. You will need to set it up so that you bake the texture manually. That's one important thing to consider. And the second crucial thing to keep in mind is that you can significantly lower the texture quality and then proceed to use it exactly as it is.